Wick Rowland just recently stepped down as the CEO of KBDI, which is the #2 PBS station here located in the area. But he's also been very involved with the Beta Station Group. I'll let him tell you a bit more about that, trying to get television stations working together on relevant programming, using the spectrum in innovative ways. He's written about this, he's very knowledgeable. Tracy, who is the executive director of the Media Alliance, which is an amazing organization in the Bay Area, very committed to independent public media, raising awareness about the issues associated with it, very knowledgeable about this, training people in local public media. Tracy has been the executive director for many years, writing about these issues. She started covering the whole issue with KCSM. How is this transition going to, will this have a good outcome, And we've sort of been working together loosely. Actually, we all met for the first time face-to-face. Well, we've known Wick, but I would just say it was fun to get together finally after being on the phone and sending emails and writing about this. So anyway, that's who these two people are. They're very knowledgeable about this. I think I'll let Tracy go ahead, because she's, as I say, she knows the ins and outs of this. Both of these people know the importance of this issue in a way that unfortunately the people at PBS and CPB apparently don't. They've never shown interest in this. I would throw, this is my own view, the board of the community college also doesn't have the vision to see what can be done with this asset, or how you develop relationships to realize the potential of the asset. That's what's at stake here. And the thing of it is, how this is resolved has great implications for public stations in other parts of the country. That's why we're having this discussion. Tracy, go ahead. Take it.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, John. I think if it's okay, and I know it's weirdly formal in such a small group, but I'm going to try standing up, because if I don't, my voice sometimes goes like this, and I want you guys to be able to hear me. Because we're such a small group, I'm hoping that once I tell you a little bit about the particular situation in Northern California and why it matters and what it means, that we'll have some time for some cross dialogue back and forth, but we'll have to see kind of how that goes. And basically what I'm going to do is tell you a story, which is how I got wrapped up in the sale or transfer of this public television station, and remain to this day, a year and a half later, entirely wrapped up in this transaction. I'm sort of desperately wanting more people to know about it, to care about it, and to see it, and to relieve me of a large canister of knowledge about this increasingly screwed up situation.
That's frank.
Well, that's kind of what we're looking at, and you'll see. So just a bit about me. I've been the ED at Media Alliance since 2007. Before that, I worked with the organization for 5 years, between 1997 and 2002. The result of that history is that I actually predate the first Media Democracy Day, which happened, I believe it was 1998 in Canada. I predate the founding of Free Press, and I remember the founding of Free Press. And coming into this movement, I've seen it go through all the transmigrations between media reform, media change, media justice, which is now a new term. Overturning capitalism also drops in occasionally. And I want to say that I try to keep my tentacles and connections to sort of all of those theories of change. I think they're all important, and I think they all play a role. And it'll be interesting to go from here, which is essentially a public media panel right next door, the minute this panel breaks out, to do a community media panel. And I very much kind of want to say that those things are connected, because a lot of what I bring when I speak about these things is from panel to panel to panel. These things are all connected and they all relate to each other. And the fate of public media affects community media, and the fate of public media affects what kind of internet we're going to have and what sort of access to information we're all going to have going forward. And there are also lots of critical things of public media that one can say, and between the connections between government and media. However, If we can't keep hold of some pieces of infrastructure, then we're going to be in a position where we are entirely dependent on how corporations will let us communicate. And frankly, most of what we want to communicate is not in their interest. So we've got an inbuilt contradiction here, and having pieces of what you would call infrastructure or real estate within the communications landscape is really important. So when we're talking about the transfer or the dissolution of the 5th largest public television license in the state of California, and the state of California is big, we're not talking about nothing. And we're also talking about dominoes, because there are, I'm going to use the word that Wick doesn't like, and now he'll get mad at me. There are what they call underperforming public television stations all over this country. There are underperforming public radio stations all over this country. There are non-commercial broadcast licenses all over this country that are at risk.
Define non-performing.
Underperforming means that there's no endowment. Major donors have not been particularly interested in these outlets. Of all the available listeners or viewers that they have, they're not really showing up too high on what you would call the Arbitrons or the Nielsen's or the viewer statistics. They're underperforming by the standards of people who keep evaluation metrics, and they're underperforming in terms of professional public media impact. And once you do that, you are vulnerable, because those are the standards to which these kinds of stations and outlets are held. Are those my standards? No. But they are the standards of the money people. And once you fall a little bit out of that sphere, you become extremely, extremely vulnerable.
So it has nothing to do with their audience. It has only.
I'm sorry?
Underperforming has nothing to do with the audience, it only has to do with the contributions.
Well, underperforming can also mean that the share of the audience is not as high as some people would like it to be.
I always thought public television wasn't supposed to work that.
Well, welcome to what we call the nonprofit industrial complex and the various ways in which it plays out. It all matters. So when we're talking about vulnerability, we have to talk about some of those things. And I'm not going to say that you can't be powerful and impactful and not have an audience. I don't think that's true, but it's challenging. And in a lot of cases, vulnerability means not meeting those kinds of sort of establishment metrics and standards. Okay, so here we are. So Kcsm has belonged to the College of San Mateo, which is a community college located about halfway between Silicon Valley and San Francisco. It's been owned for 48 years, 1964. It's as old as I am. And no, really, we have the same birthday, me and Kcsm. And the station is currently digital, not analog. It has a large antenna on top of Mount Sutro. It is currently played on 80 different cable stations throughout Northern California. Appears on 10 counties and potentially reaches an audience of about 19 million people. Do those 19 million people watch it? Probably not. However, they could. So when you're talking about power and potential and impact, you're talking about quite a bit. So the folks that run the College of San Mateo and two other community colleges, I think Cañada and Skyline, are, you know, educational bureaucrats. They're elected to their board seats. And what they know about radio, public media, you could fit in your pinky, you know, not their area of expertise whatsoever. So they sat down and they noticed they own a radio station that plays jazz, and it's a good jazz station, and they own this television station. And they looked and they said, radio station, making money. Television station, not so much money. And there's a reason for that, because it's really expensive to produce television by comparison to radio. You're talking about a factor of about 10 to 1. And it's also true that the jazz station is, shall we say, uncontroversial. Everybody loves good music. And it doesn't get them in trouble. However, a public affairs television station, it can get you into trouble, or at least some trouble. And when you're politically elected and so on, you don't always want to get into trouble. So anyway, they took a look and said, radio station, good, we'll keep that. Television station, not so good, we'll get rid of it. Admittedly, leading up to the decision to, pass it on, to transfer it. You could say they weren't putting a lot of energy into making the television station thrive. I think that's fair to say. I mean, certainly programming could have been more vital and more energy could have been put in. Of course, you run around trying to solicit support or you don't. And I think it's fair to say that they were not. But that's, of course, a choice that you make about the energy that you want to invest and how excited you are in having 19 million people potentially be able to watch your station. They were not so excited. I think that's fair to say. Wick is a friend of the general manager, and he may have some insight into what I'm saying as an outsider, because I don't work there, but kind of that's, but that's my perception. So, yeah.
How many PBSs are in? I mean, you've got KQED. Is this the second major PBS in the market, or are there several?
For television, yes. KQED recently, not recently, but some time ago purchased KTEH, which was the San Jose-based or Silicon Valley public television station. So now they are one sort of huge entity. And there are still people in San Jose that are really unhappy about that because they liked their San Jose station, and it now parallels the San Francisco station. It's a very large station. It plays some good programs, but it's pretty straightforward, mainstream NPR. It is heavily underwritten. It's not a particularly listener-sponsored station in many ways. They got rid of their whole listener-elected board structure. The fund drives are a very tiny percentage of the income now. So I think people would say it's definitely on the mainstream side of NPR operations, but it's huge. Other than that, there's not a lot of public television working.
KRCB in Roanoke Park.
Yes.
It's part of the Bay Area.
Yes, KRCB in Roanoke Park, which is in the North Bay. And if you know anything about the Bay Area, that's the hippie Redwoods part.
and there is yet another spin-off from KQED. So the channel, what is it in Henry? The channel in San Francisco, the one that
was channel. Yeah. That's right. Channel 32 right. is called a minority television project.
Right, exactly.
It's an independent operation. To answer your
question, there were 5 licenses allocated to the Bay Area for non-commercial educational television stations and a bunch of radio licenses.
KMTP plays primarily Asian language programming. It's on the commercial-ish side. Okay. So, yes.
You might get to this, but the license, who decides who gets a license, and then who are the directors?
We'll talk a bit about that. Okay, so we have our board of directors. They say no TV, so long process, and they put it up for what we would call a transfer. And a transfer means, because this is a non-commercial license, it can't be changed to a commercial scenario, they're looking for a new operator to run this non-commercial television station. People who have funds to run non-commercial television stations aren't found everywhere, of course, so they put it out to bid. They get 6 bids. Of those bids, only about 2 of them were sort of anywhere close to the money that they were hoping to get, which was about $6 million. One of them was from a public radio entity, and we looked at it as an outsider and as an advocate and said, but they run public radio stations, why would they want to run a public television station? And it wasn't really very clear why they were looking. Another came from the Colorado area, which is why it makes it interesting to come here and talk to Colorado, and was from the co-founder of Free Speech TV.
Free Speech?
Free Speech TV, who is now on and doing some other stuff, which sounded pretty good in terms of what the available options are. So as an advocacy organization, we went marching over to them and said, look, if you don't want to run this non-commercial broadcast station, what we would say as media advocates is you need to take responsibility for transferring this to another entity that will run it in the interests of non-commercial public interest television. That's your responsibility. So we're going to file a public records request so we can see what all these bids look like and let the public know what the heck is going to happen to these radio stations when they turn on channel whatever it is. They'll have some idea what to expect. What we found out is they said boo on your public records request. And 3 days before they told us what was going to happen to the station, we got to see the bids. And 3 days later, they said they're turning down all bids. And one of the bids, as we said, was from, you know, co-founder of Free Speech TV, $6 million, not a bad chunk of change. And we were sort of like, what's going on? So we found out what's going on. What's going on is there's $5 million or there's more money. You talked about sort of who owns the license and who decides. Well, you own the license, basically. Public owns the license.
Right.
The Federal Communications Commission, of which you've heard, which is an agency, administers sort of the, shall we say, rental of these licenses. Now, it's not co-rental in the sense that you pay for it. Originally, the community college district was gifted with these licenses and told to operate them in the public interest as an educational institution on behalf of the people of San Mateo. And they've owned them ever since. But potentially they can transfer that ownership. And it's interesting because even though they didn't pay for it in the first place, although they paid to operate it since 1964, they get to exert price for someone to basically take over their ownership. So they said $6 million, you can run the TV station. And they could have said $10 million and they could have said $2 million. But this is kind of what they came up with as a sort of ongoing price. So operating the television station is one possibility, but now we have some other possibilities, which is we can take the spectrum, we can take the bandwidth, we can take what the station sort of owns in terms of frequency, and we can do something with that has nothing to do with continuing to operate a public station. So the FCC came up with the idea that they were going to sort of repackage spectrum, because as we've all heard, we have more and more cell phones and wireless devices and iPads and tablets, and just at this conference you can see how many there are, because everybody's on one, and it's taking up more and more space. So the FCC is going to go ahead and repackage all of this spectrum in order to free more of it up for wireless use. And by doing that, they need to sort of grab more, saying to broadcasters, if you want to sell some of what you've got, because when you move from analog to digital, you go squinch, and there's extra space on the side. The idea was that broadcasters would sell, and again, this is an interesting thing because broadcasters, at least in the non-commercial sphere, didn't really pay for their licenses in the first place. Most of them. But they can sell off some or all of their spectrum and make some money. And of course, everybody, especially in the non-commercial sector, and when we're talking about educational institutions, they don't have any money. I mean, colleges are desperate for money. They're thinking we can sell this stuff like it's a condo in Maui. We can sell it off and get some stuff. It's, you know, it's almost as good as selling off the humanities building.
Better.
So it occurred to them, not only that they could sell part of it, the part that they don't need, they could sell the whole darn thing. And then they would get 3 times as much money or 4 times as much money. So they said, to heck with Free Speech TV, to heck with $6 million. Let's do this again and put out an offer to just sell the whole shindig and make as much money as we possibly can. And I went to a board meeting and there's a chancellor there and he's saying we can make 10 million, we can make 15 million. We don't even know how much money we can make. Everybody wants our spectrum. The wireless companies are desperate for it. And you know, I kind of looked at him and said, our spectrum? Nothing personal, but like my spectrum. And you're not asking me. You're not asking the public at all.
So it sounds like a non-profit all of a sudden wants to become a profit, basically.
But they don't know that.
It's a non-profit that wants to basically turn a non-commercial broadcast license that was gifted to them into as much money as they humanly can get. And if they can sell it to a corporation and make a bunch of money that way.
So the heck with the audience, right?
Well, basically, I mean, as the stand-in for the audience, because that's kind of what I'm doing, because the audience is busy and they have jobs and they don't want to go to board meetings at the College of San Mateo in the middle of Belmont Canyon on Wednesday nights. So I go and I act as the public, and they basically say, no, you can't see the bids, no, it's not up to you, and go away. And we've been doing this for 2 years. And I don't go away, and they know this, but...
Tracy, are you totally alone? Do you have anybody to go with you to this?
At the board meetings, yes, I'm pretty much all alone. We have had people writing and calling and asking about the situation, But the schlepping down to Belmont Canyon part, and I have to say that the College of San Mateo is way back on a hill. I take public transit down there, and literally the guy on the bus knows me because nobody takes the bus into Belmont Canyon. And he started to ask me, why are you doing this? And I, told him what I was doing, and he was like, well, great, you go get him. But I'm the only person on this bus by the time it hits that part.
But it is open to the public.
It is. It is. It is not advertised. The only way you will ever find out when those board meetings are is on an obscure website, or you'll call me. But yes, it is open to the public. You can come and you can make your 2-minute public comment after driving for an hour for the opportunity.
It happens all the time.
Yeah, so here we are. So we've had a spectrum bidding process. This bidding process said, well, not only will we take bids to operate the television station, we'll also take bids from any entity, commercial, non-commercial, to partner with us. And what that means is you will run the radio station, this partner, you'll pay our costs because we're broke, and then you'll sell the spectrum and give us half. This is what the university says. So it's basically a capitalist scenario for someone to come in, cover their costs, and then everyone will hit the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, except for the public, which doesn't really get much out of the deal. I mean, maybe the College of San Mateo will thrive and there'll be a couple more offerings of English 103 that people need. But in terms of the public using the public airwaves, we got nothing. Absolutely nothing. So that's where we are. We have heard public records request number 2 was also turned down. So what we are basically is we're sort of waiting to hear what bids came in through the grapevine. We have a pretty good idea that someone took them up on what I call the spectrum speculator deal, because really, why wouldn't they? And so we're kind of waiting to find out, and what we're looking at is the station operating for some period of time until the spectrum sale goes off, basically on some private person's dime. And then that private entity will, make a 10 or 15 or $20 million sale, split the proceeds with the district, and that's the end of that. No more alternative public media. And when you look at potentially what something like free speech TV could do with a property like that, it's pretty tragic.
Yeah.
And before I finish up, and we can take questions, basically what we feel here is, because we've seen a lot of this happening with college radio, just sort of on the mini micro scale, because those stations aren't worth that kind of money. But again, you have public educational institutions, not usually the enemy or the demon, but they've got no money. And they start to look at these things and go, sure, we can train students in broadcasting, that's nice. We can fulfill the public interest, that's nice. Or we could make an extra 500,000, 1 million, 3.3 million, or 10 million. So let's just get rid of the thing. And you have capitalist interests in one way or the other that will take advantage of their desire to basically just sell these things off. And as I said, it's no different than raffling off the Humanities Building and calling it like the Exxon Art Center. It's really the same thing. They're basically taking a public asset and saying, okay, how can we make money on this? Because we're not getting money from the government. Education is starved, so let's just throw the public airwaves in the garbage. So when you see it happening in the radio spectrum, it was only kind of a matter of time till it started to happen in television. Bigger licenses, more money. And now we see this, and it sort of is like a pilot case or kind of a domino for, all right, there's a whole bunch of other public television licenses held by financially stressed institutions, and they're all going to start flooding on the market in this way.
I think that's a good place to switch to WIC, because we talked about the perils and the promise, and so far Tracy has largely told us about the perils. But
I'm sorry, like I said, it's a horrible cancer of information in my head.
I'll tell you, this is it's a heroic thing to be covering this and telling the story, because the public doesn't know about this. That's part of the problem, and the lack of vision that that could go into this. But there is, I don't want to, we've got to spend some time on the promise.
Okay.
And that's where we come in.
So let me finish the sentence in transition, because it really was the last sentence. I swear to you.
Go right ahead.
Basically, what we've got here is like a domino, and the question becomes, is this going to basically domino out across the country. And I think the answer is that it is going to. So in addition to the sort of, the NPR struggle with the government that we're sort of seeing, and the self-censorship going on with PBS, and they're all about Sesame Street, not about, shall we say, questioning the status quo, because that's what they feel they have to say on Capitol Hill, not to get squashed. But it becomes a problem. We also have stuff from the bottom, where the smaller public media entities of all kinds are also going to come under this kind of self-motivation to basically dissolve and eradicate themselves. I mean, I went to the board meeting, and the trustees, who were supposed to be running educational institutions, referred to this huge television signal as the equivalent of a junked car. It's like, how myopic do you have to be? You're educated people. This is what you're educating? Oh God, God help us. So basically the question becomes, in this environment, what are we going to do to save public media? Because community media, same kinds of financial stresses, maybe worse. And how can we turn around the incentives so that these organizations can operate, rather than apparently facing pressures both from the top and the bottom to basically self-censor and dissolve themselves? That's a crisis.
Thank you, Tracy.
So Vic?
Very clearly, but there is a promise component here, which I think Vic can tell us about. So, Vic, please.
I don't know when I'm going to get to the promise part, because there are some other issues that are related to it. This is a great overview and summary of what's been going on, and Tracy really gets credit for having doggedly followed this thing through, because it has been pretty much ignored by the mainstream press in the Bay Area, and as she suggests, almost deliberately ignored inside Washington from the CBB and PBS ranks as well. A couple of points in fair disclosure here, to be really clear, pick up on something Tracy said and then add a few other personal notes. I am a very good friend, personal friend of Marilyn Lawrence, who is the general manager of Kcsm. She and I go back a good time. We were co-founders, charter members of something called the Beta Group, which is the organization, the affinity group of alternative public television stations in the country. As you may know, the licenses of public television stations are held by different kinds of entities. There are university licensees, there are state organization associations, there are stations held by very large market nonprofit corporations, 501c3s. There are very small stations, tiny budgets, many of them in remote rural places all over the country, and there are stations like Channel 12 here, which are also in large markets, but also small budget and alternative operations. Each of those groups has its own affinity cohort. So there's a University Licensee Association, there's a Major Market Group Association, there's a State Broadcasters Association, and so on. Small station associations have been in existence for a long time, and I was once chair of it. But it's, we found some years ago that it was necessary for the alternative stations to band together to represent our needs before the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and PBS, and seek other ways in which we could cooperate together. So, bless her heart, back in the day, Marilyn was one of the charter members of the Beta Group, and we worked together quite closely over the years. A couple of other things that I should note is that, of course, a background issue here is that the state budget cuts in California have been horrendous, and they have done tremendous damage to the budgets of the universities and colleges. And now I'm wearing my other hat, my other life as an academic, thinking a lot about those kind of institutional issues. And the stress on which Kcsm has been under is in large part, not totally, but in large part directly related to the inability of the San Mateo College District to figure out how to continue to support it out of operating general fund. monies, and that's just a reality. And you're seeing this all over the country among university and college licensees, particularly among the smaller regional, local state college institutions. The big land-grant institutions, I was at the University of Illinois for many years. We have big, robust public media operations there, AM, FM radio, and television. They're stressed, but they're not about to give them up. Madison, Wisconsin is, the University of Wisconsin is not going to give up its licenses to that big, powerful state network. But smaller state colleges all over the country are really thinking through whether they can, afford to continue to operate those entities, and or are forcing them out more into the marketplace to seek corporate underwriting and, of course, individual memberships as well. So those are contextual issues that I think are really important to understand in evaluating this case. Another couple of points of reference are as well, both of the top bidders in the first round in response to that RFP from the college about buying the station were out of Boulder. Okay. One of them, as you identified, was local, but the other one is too. It's a public radio capital, which is a big financing entity for public radio stations all over the country, was the other. And the co-principal who was driving that one lives in Boulder as well. So we have to look in the mirror closely, guys, when we think about this. The other bidder is not only the founder of Free Speech TV, he also was a founder of Channel 12.
Wow.
And of another public television station in Philadelphia, and back in the day, a few public radio stations as well too. So there's a deep history there of involvement in the creation of new public media entities, so you want to sort of keep that in mind too. And then maybe finally one other sort of point of fact. While it is true that the board of the San Mateo College District is thinking in material terms, in the asset value terms about this license, this is not new in the annals of American broadcasting. The ink was fairly dry on the 1927 Radio Act when owners of stations started to sell them to other people. That is to say, to be involved in the trafficking of the licenses that they held. And whenever you would have, and that process went along in commercial radio for years and years and years, and then it was adopted in commercial television as well. And often people would come to evaluate these sales and transfers and ask, well, what's the value here? What is it? Why is a television station in San Francisco, a commercial station, selling for $450 million? I mean, you could take their studio space, all of their cameras, all of their transmitter equipment and towers and so on. It doesn't add up to that, okay? The desks, computers, and so on. Why? Because there's a little piece of paper that they have on their wall that says that they have a license from the FCC to operate on that specific frequency. That is to say, they have a monopoly on that particular entity. And that drives up the price because there is a rate of return opportunity associated with those commercial stations. So the trafficking in licenses and the treating of them as private property, despite the fact that we all know that the airwaves are owned by the public, that contradiction, much the way it has been in fisheries licenses, the way it has been in forest licenses, all sorts of things in which the public asset is leased, is given out. Okay. The difference in the situation in the broadcasting world is that the commercial world never had to pay very much for that. Okay. Transfer fees are nominal. There was no substantial tax on those transfers. So it really was a free deal. Over the years, there was very little interest in transferring public licensees, the so-called non-commercial educational reserve frequencies. They were not thought of as very fungible, moving about from one entity to another. If your community group or your university or your state educational authority got the license, it was kind of assumed you were going to hold it in perpetuity and continue to operate. More recently, as the fiscal distresses have manifested themselves around the country, then it has become a question in the eyes of many of the license holders about whether they should transfer this to other entities. And oh aha, think about it the way the commercial world has been in terms of earning some return for that as well. So that's a relatively new phenomenon in the public world, but it's actually an old habit and frankly sanctioned quite heavily over and over again by Congress and the FCC in the private world as well too. So the public stations are beginning to act more like the commercial stations in that regard. There is an irony in this case in Kcsm instance, because of course one of the great original holders of the faith of educational and non-commercial broadcasting were universities and colleges. As many of you may know, in the history of radio, it was really the big land-grant institutions that held on during the years of the late 20s, the 30s, and the 40s, when the FCC was otherwise sort of forcing non-commercial entities out of the radio business. There had been hundreds of them back in the 1920s. We reallocated. There were only a couple of dozen left, and it was those big universities. The electrical engineering departments were interested in this technology called radio. It was fascinating. And of course, the land-grant schools, all having colleges of agriculture and extension services, were thinking about this as a way of getting the signal out, the message from the university, the education, and the research, just the way they would in terms of agricultural techniques and practices. So the irony that now you should find some of the university, college institutions giving up the ghost is I think profound to us. The other thing as well is that this intention that Tracy hinted at with regard to at least one of the bidders last year for the Kcsm and Kcsm to monetize the frequency beyond the value of just operating it and turning it into a, keeping it as a public media enterprise and operating it perhaps with a different content and programming set of services profile, comes about as a result of the so-called National Broadband Plan, which you're otherwise hearing a lot about in this conference. And it is perhaps one of the unintended consequences of the notion of the spectrum auction, which Chairman Janikowski of the FCC has been so famously or infamously supportive of, unfortunately with White House support as well too, because now it has raised the question in the minds of financially stressed college districts, well, maybe there is a way in which we can turn a profit here and get some money for this. You can't call it anything else but a sale in the incentive auction process. One of the cautions here, and we were talking about this yesterday, is that I'm not certain that the folks at the college district, let alone among a couple of the bidders, have done their homework well enough, because I am not convinced that there is in fact that much lucre available in the incentive auction relative to this particular frequency. And that has the whole complex calculus associated with the San Francisco market, all of the stations that are there, the repacking that'll take place and so on, and how that can be worked out. We have done a parallel analysis here in Denver, because of course there was a lot of question about channels 12 and 6. Would we have any kind of reason to think maybe we ought to sell one of them off, we ought to combine forces, we ought to trim off, how should we do this? Well, we've done our homework, and it doesn't look good from the standpoint of there actually being an incentive auction in this market. And that has to do with the fact that there isn't as much packing of neighboring markets of other stations that would have to be relocated. FCC can probably get its 120 megahertz out of this market and repack everybody without causing channel sharing. Right? So there's not going to be any financial incentive for anybody to sell. None of the commercial broadcasters here want to, are intending to. I don't think either Channel 6 or Channel 12 are interested at this point in doing it, and there will be no pressure on us too as well, for the most part. So I think the San Francisco market is similarly situated. This is not the same on the East Coast or along the Canadian border or in the Deep South, frankly, in market after market in the Midwest. There is a lot of concentration of television stations there, and it could be that the incentive auction will be much more attractive in those environments than it will be out here in these kind of isolated issues. But so there may be a bit of a whistling through the graveyard sort of aspect to this from the standpoint of the college district, and I'm not really certain that they're going to make all of that money. The issue though of putting this station on the block raises some other interesting problems as well. One of the concerns that many have had with regard to the notion of putting up a non-commercial license for transfer, for sale, has been, well, who is eligible to accept to take it over? You know, who would have the money and pay you, but even in the eyes of the FCC would be reasonable to take it on. One of the big fears is that religious organizations would be willing to do this. As many of you know, a lot of the so-called non-commercial educational frequencies are occupied by religious organizations. My wife is from northern Florida, and whenever I'm down in Lake City with her, and I listen to what I think is public radio there. You know, I get the University of Florida Gainesville station. There's one over in Jacksonville, and barely I could pick one up from Tallahassee. There are 6 religious stations on that lower 20% of the FM band on the reserved frequencies. Okay, somebody's making a lot of money on memberships to religious stations. That movement, as you know, is national, and it has transferred over into television now. And particularly the Daystar operation has shown a great deal of interest in getting hold of non-commercial television frequencies for similar proselytization and monetization regions. So one of the concerns that has been raised by the secular public broadcasting community has been, well, maybe, you know, the FCC should look skeptically on those kinds of transfers because an outfit like Daystar really is a national organization. They're going to take over that frequency and they're going to network it with whatever their programming is. And it really won't have any aspects of local content and control. You know, it won't even be a local governing board and blah, blah, blah. It'll be kind of like some of the big national commercial groups. Okay? You know, here in town, Gannett, CBS owned and operated stations, Scripps Howard, which, you know, Fox. So, well, that argument has actually been pretty persuasive at the FCC. It's got to be local control, right? Got to have local governance. Got to guarantee that community does it. That fights off Daystar. What it also, however, does is runs against the possibility of an outside organization like Independent Public Media, one of the ones we're talking about, or others, to come in and say, we have some resources, we could invest in this, and we are willing to set this up, when in fact, of course, they also expect to have some kind of voice in how that works itself out. And so one of the issues that Tracy was referring to was, in effect, the tension between the local and extra-local ownership operations that might occur. Now, I've got an interest in this problem because I actually think from a standpoint of efficiency and maybe doing things better to conserve resources and concentrate what we can do, encouraging some kind of group ownership of non-commercial licensees around the country, and particularly in the beta group and the alternative group, might not actually be a bad idea. That is to say, why not think about taking the back office work at Channel 12 here in Denver and that of Kcsm, and I'm talking, you know, the human
Like Denver
resources.
Post and Rockies.
A joint operating agreement, exactly, of some kind, the technical management facilities and so on, and figure out how you might manage those on a...
Or like NFL, one franchise helping the little one.
Right, exactly. So this raises an interesting possibility, but as you can see, there are conflicting countercurrent policy issues at work here. So one of the tricks will be if one of the original two bidders continues and becomes successful, is how that's going to get managed more generally. But they could have an ameliorative effect in other ways around the country. One of the problems we've got is that there is absolutely no discussion about this or thought about it at the level of CPB or PBS, which is unfortunate. They're not addressing this. And in fact, they're kind of ducking the whole thing. CPB has got a policy of trying to encourage mergers at the local level. They would just love Channel 6 and 12 to get together. Symbolically, it would love it. It doesn't care about the loss of voice, perhaps, or the diversity, so on. But they think in Congress that would be a big seller. I don't think they're right, but that's their attitude about it. But why not be thinking in terms of facilitating collaborations and mergers of entities on an extra local level, and maybe in terms of these affinity groups that I was talking about, that there's more alike. Channel 12 and Kcsm and the San Bernardino station and the LA School District station and KBTC in Tacoma, Seattle have more in common with one another than they do necessarily with the sister stations in their own markets. And so figure out how to make advantage of that. So that's one of the issues that we're really thinking about dealing with. The other thing I would kind of want to put on the table, John, is that I've been surprised at the lack of interest in the Bay Area in this matter. That not only has the press kind of ignored it, with the exception of Tracy, so has the funding community. I mean, there are major foundations in San Francisco. Kcsm is at the head of Silicon Valley. You think of all of the money, the .com type of web-based kind of money that's down there, and no one's stepping up to the plate in this. And you would think that there would be a kind of an interest in preserving this public access, this asset, particularly when there are people who are otherwise so seemingly progressive on social and other sorts of issues. So that's another dilemma that we need to explore. So those are some of my thoughts. The promise, John, in short, is if we were able to save it, keep it going, I think, particularly on a cooperative basis, there's a lot of shared programming and content that we can develop around the country. I guess that's so obvious to me, I skip over it. I should probably underscore that and emphasize it a bit more. I mean, whether, working with free speech, working with Wing TV, working with Megahertz and other sort of consortia, we could really probably do quite a good job with that entity and build out the local content aspects.
And all the other entities across the country that will fall into the same.
So that's it.
I have a question about the broadband, the band, the frequency.
Yes. Yeah.
Which can be sliced now,
Right.
as opposed with the past, which it couldn't.
That's right.
Now, instead of selling slices, can you lease them? Like federal land,
Oh, gosh, I wish you were in charge in Washington. This is an argument that I have had about the National Broadband Plan from the get-go. I'll back up. I'll answer your question indirectly. I'll get to it. But one of the reasons that one of the bidders for the Kcsm license has the wherewithal to offer money to the college district for this transfer is that he has very cleverly made a good deal of money for a nonprofit foundation consortium out of the lease of frequencies in the 2.5 gigahertz band, 2,500 megahertz band, up in what's called the Educational Broadcasting Service range. Now, I know a lot about this because he got us into this business years ago, and we have profited from those leases as well too, at Channel 12 here, and other public television stations, large and small, particularly universities also, that's as well. That is to say, the FCC had a policy that said, if you are the non-commercial holder of that license, you may lease them for commercial purposes to the Sprints, Verizons, the wireless entities in the world. And that has been done very successfully. And the so-called EBS companies, independent public media, have done this in 9 markets around the country and have turned that into a tidy endowment, which now creates the opportunity. Right. So all I'm saying is the FCC already has a policy in one sector for leasing and just the way. I have raised that question because obviously it's something that we know a lot about at Channel 12 over and over and over again of the head of the Mass Media Bureau, Bill Lake, at the FCC and various commissioners. And why can't we do the same thing with regard to the spectrum auction? Why does it have to be a sale?
If I could add, the FCC always had the option to exempt non-commercial licenses from this upcoming spectrum auction, and there was some pressure on them to do so. The idea being, if it's non-commercial, then therefore speculation is not the point.
Right.
They chose not to. And the reason that they chose not to is that one of Janikowski's signature programs was this spectrum auction that would contribute to deficit reduction, a very popular term in Washington. And this was a positive way to generate revenues for the Treasury. And
You can auction leases.
the leases would not be nearly as lucrative as the sales.
Well, they are cash cows for the long term.
The fact of the matter...
The numbers that were thrown around involve the sales.
Well, and in any case...
That's what Congress went for.
No, that's what Congress wants. It's meaningless. I said yesterday in the other session that the amount of federal funding for public broadcasting is equivalent to 1 grain of sand on the federal budget beach. Okay, so you're going to really solve deficit problems by cutting out all the federal funding. Right. Okay. The amount of money involved in the auction proceeds to be put into deficit maybe amount to your child's bucket of sand on the federal budget beach. I mean, it is not going to add up to any kind of significant contribution to deficit reduction. It's symbolic.
It's symbolic.
It's a way of sort of making the FCC look good in the eyes of Congress. I think Congress meeting, I'm sorry, we're really serious about this. But the fact of the matter is, technologically, business operations-wise, there is absolutely no reason why the spectrum that is being considered for auction could not be leased. The wireless industries don't want to do it because they won't make as much money, and it's more complex operationally. But it
Looks like we have one.
Yeah, we have some questions here.
Is there a question in the back?
Well, there's 2 questions. Go ahead. We'll take them. We'll take questions from anyone. Go
So
ahead.
what do you want us to do? What do you think is the best outcome for this situation? How can we jump in and get involved?
Carol is from the Bay Area.
Oh.
Yes,
drive
Carol and
to
I
these
know each
meetings.
other quite well, and she's now going to be talked to about the drive to Belmont Canyon. But what can we do? I think there's a couple of things that we can do. I think we have to call spectrum speculation what it is. I think we have to keep educational institutions and the licensees of non-commercial broadcasters accountable for these licenses that they were gifted. If they're having trouble running them financially, one can be empathetic to that, but that doesn't mean that they get to sell them off like they're a condo. There's got to be some sort of A doesn't lead to B. If they need assistance covering expenses, if they need to find another nonprofit public interest entity to take over, that can be done. Can you just sell it off to the highest bidder? No, you can't. So that's one thing. You know, these institutions are vulnerable to public pressure and public opinion from their own constituents and their own stakeholders.
If we only had more of it.
Well, it's the part where you have to say the public airwaves belong to the public and people have to hear that. The constituents and stakeholders in this organization have to understand that. And the public property myth or the private property myth really has to be cracked. Because what they say is, we own it and F you. And if there's not a proper response to that, then that kind of becomes the law of the land. In addition, I think it's some interesting stuff that was brought up. Part of me says, oh my God, about, you know, localism being sort of shoved underground because we fought so hard for that. And essentially, you know, syndicated programming packages can work both for good and for evil. But he's also right about the financial sustainability questions. And local media and original programming can also be insanely expensive. Yeah. And there are ways in which we have to look at responsible collaboration. And the question of how you carve that off from operations like Daystar and how you carve that off from operations essentially like Clear Channel, let's face it, right, and not have a clear channel of the non-commercial sector is the tricky part and the challenging part and the part that we all have to kind of think about.